The Belgorod-Khar'kov Offensive Operation or Fourth Battle of Kharkov was an operation conducted as part of Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev between the Red Army with 1,144,000 soldiers and the Wehrmacht with 200,000 soldiers around the city of Kharkov. It was one of the operations that followed the Battle of Kursk. Prelude. Following the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army launched Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev on 3 August 1943, which aimed to retake the cities of Belgorod and Kharkov. On the first day, the units of the Voronezh Front quickly penetrated the German front-line defences on the boundary of the 4th Panzer Army and Army Group Kempf between Tomarovka and Belgorod and gained 100 kilometers in a sector along the Attribution line along the banks of the Merla River. They were finally halted on 12 August by armoured units of the 3rd Panzer Corps. On 5 August 1943, 11th Corps evacuated the city of Belgorod. Following its withdrawal from Belgorod on the night of 5–6 August 1943, the 11th Army Corps, under the command of now held defensive positions south of the city between the Donets and Lopan rivers north of Kharkov. The 11th Army Corps consisted of a Kampfgruppe from the 167th Infantry Division, the 168th, 106th, 198th, 320th Infantry Divisions, and the 6th Panzer Division, which acted as was the Corps Reserve B. This constituted a deep salient east into Soviet lines and was subject to outflanking attempts on the Corps' left flank. Indeed, Soviet armoured units had already appeared 20 miles behind the Corps front line. 11th Army Corps now made a series of phased withdrawals toward Kharkov to prevent encirclement, only reaching the final defences north of the city on 12 August 1943. Following breakthroughs by the 57th and 69th Armies in several sectors of the front line, the disintegration of the 168th Infantry Division, and after an intervention by the Corps Reserve, when its attempts to force a breakthrough in the Belgorod-Khar'kov met with frustration along the Merla River, the Steppe Front directed its assaults towards Korotych, a sector held by 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, to cut the Poltava-Kharkov rail link. Fierce fighting ensued, in which Korotych was captured by the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps and subsequently recaptured by grenadiers from 2nd SS, then to remain under German control. But the 5th Guards Tank Army did cut the rail link finally on the 22nd of August 1943. The loss of this vital line of communication, while not fatal in itself, was a serious blow to the ability of Army Group Kempf to defend the city from the constant Red Army attacks. This meant critical delays of supplies and reinforcements, and the unit's position was becoming increasingly untenable. The way to Poltava now remained open, but Vatutin hesitated to push through while the Germans flanking the gap held firm. Instead, he turned his left flank armies, the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 5th Guards Army, against the western front of Army Group Kempf, where the 2nd and 3rd SS Panzer Divisions fought to keep the front angled southwestward away from Kharkov. On the weaker east front of Army Group Kempf, the Soviet 57th Army cleared the right bank of the Donets between Chugayev and Zmiev. But the Army Command somehow could not quite bring itself to try for a full-scale breakthrough. These threats had led to a request by General Werner Kempf to abandon the city on 12 August 1943. Erich von Manstein did not object, but Adolf Hitler countered with an order that the city had to be held under all circumstances. See after a prediction that the order to hold Kharkov would produce another Stalingrad. On 14 August 1943, Manstein relieved Kempf and appointed General Otto Wohler in his place. A few days later, Army Group Kempf was renamed the 8th Army. Kharkov now constituted a deep German salient to the east, which prevented the Red Army from making use of this vital traffic and supply center. Following boastful reports made by Soviet radio that Soviet troops had entered the city, when in fact it was still held by 11th Army Corps, Joseph Stalin personally ordered its immediate capture. General Rouse, the officer commanding the city, takes up the story. It was clear that the Russians would not make a frontal assault on the projecting Kharkov salient, but would attempt to break through the narrowest part of Xi Army Corps' defensive arc west of the city, in order to encircle the town. We deployed all available anti-tank guns on the northern edge of the bottleneck, which rose like a bastion, and emplaced numerous 88mm flak guns in depth on the high ground. This anti-tank defense alone would not have been sufficient to repulse the expected Soviet mass tank attack, but at the last moment reinforcements in the form of the Das Reich Panzer Regiment arrived with a strong panzer component. I immediately dispatched it to the most endangered sector. The 96 Panther tanks, 35 Tiger tanks, and 25 Sturmgeschütz, 3 self-propelled assault guns had hardly taken their positions on the 20th of August 1943 when the first large-scale attack got underway. However, the Russian tanks had been recognized while they were still assembling in the villages and floodplains of a brook valley. Within a few minutes, heavily laden Stukas came on in wedge formation and unloaded their cargoes of destruction in well-timed dives on the enemy tanks. Caught in this congested area, dark fountains of earth erupted skyward and were followed by heavy thunderclaps and shocks that resembled an earthquake. These were the heaviest 2-ton bombs, designed for use against battleships, which were all that Luftwaffe 4 had left to counter the Russian attack. Soon all the villages occupied by Soviet tanks lay in flames. A sea of dust and smoke clouds illuminated by the setting sun hung over the brook valley, while dark mushrooms of smoke from burning tanks stood out in stark contrast. This gruesome picture bore witness to an undertaking that left death and destruction in its wake, hitting the Russians so hard that they could no longer launch their projected attack that day, regardless of Joseph Stalin's order. Such a severe blow inflicted on the Soviets had purchased badly needed time for Xi Army Corps to reorganize. The supply situation in Kharkov was now catastrophic. Artillerymen, after firing their last rounds, were abandoning their guns to fight as infantrymen. The Army's supply depot had 5 trainloads of spare tank tracks left over from Zitadel, but very little else. The high consumption of ammunition in the last month and a half had cut into supplies put aside for the last 2 weeks of August and the first 2 weeks of September. Until the turn of the month, the Army would have to get along with 50% of its daily average requirements in artillery and tank ammunition. 11th Army Corps now had a combat strength of only 4,000 infantrymen, 1 man for every 10 yards of front. General Erhard Rouse explains the intensity of the constant Russian attacks. On the 20th of August, the Russians avoided mass groupings of tanks, crossed the Brook Valley simultaneously in a number of places, and disappeared into the broad cornfields that were located ahead of our lines, ending at the east-west roll barn several hundred meters in front of our main battle line. Throughout the morning, Soviet tanks worked their way forward in the hollows up to the southern edges of the cornfields, then made a mass dash across the road in full sight. Das Reich's Panthers caught the leading waves of T-34s with fierce defensive fire before they could reach our main battle line. Yet wave after wave followed, until Russian tanks flowed across in the protecting hollows and pushed forward into our battle positions. Here a net of anti-tank and flak guns, Hornet 88mm tank destroyers, and Wasp self-propelled 105mm field howitzers trapped the T-34s, split them into small groups, and put large numbers out of action. The final waves were still attempting to force a breakthrough in concentrated masses when the Tigers and Stug 3 self-propelled assault guns which represented our mobile reserves behind the front, attacked the Russian armor and repulsed it with heavy losses. The price paid by the 5th Guards Tank Army for this mass assault amounted to 184 knocked-out T-34s. Wohler, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, did not prove any more resolute. In view of the harsh realities facing the defenders of Kharkov, he knew that the depleted infantry regiments could not hold their positions without copious artillery support. 2 days after taking command of 8th Army, Wohler also asked Manstein for permission to abandon the city. Regardless of Hitler's demand that the city be held, Wohler and Manstein agreed that the city could not be defended for long. Given the diminishing German strength and the overwhelming size of Soviet reserves. On the 21st of August 1943, Manstein gave his consent to withdraw from Kharkov. The largely destroyed Soviet city, which changed hands several times during the war, was about to be recaptured by the Soviets for the last time. During the day of the 22nd of August 1943, the Germans began their exodus from the city under great pressure from the Soviets. The 57th and 69th Armies pushed in from 3 sides with the coming of daylight. The Soviets sensed that the Germans were evacuating Kharkov due to the lessening of artillery fire and diminishing resistance in the front lines. Later in the day, thunderous explosions were heard as ammo dumps were blown. Large German columns were then observed leaving the city and the Soviet troops pushed into the town itself. Moving out of Kharkov to the south, the Germans desperately fought to hold open a corridor through which a withdrawal could be made. All along the corridor through which the 8th Army evacuated Kharkov, Soviet artillery and mortars pounded the withdrawal. Their planes gathered for the kill and attacked the German columns leaving the city, strafing and bombing the men and vehicles. Enormous fires were set by the Germans in hope of delaying the Soviet advance. The city became a hellish place of fire and smoke, artillery fire and desperate combat, punctuated by the explosions of supply dumps. By 0200 on the 23rd of August 1943, elements of the 183rd Rifle Division pushed into the city center, reached the huge Dzerzhinsky Square and met men from the 89th Rifle Division. The victorious Soviet troops hoisted a red banner over the city once again. By 1100, Kharkov and its outskirts had been liberated completely. The fourth and final battle for the city was over. Aftermath. By re-establishing a continuous front on Army Group South's left flank, the 4th Panzer Army and the 8th Army had for the moment blunted a deadly thrust, but to the north and southeast fresh blows had already been dealt or were in the making. Employing the peculiar rippling effect that marked their offensives, the Red Army, thwarted in one place, had shifted to others. For the first time in the war they had the full strategic initiative, and they grasped it jealously without regard for economy of effort, tactical sophistication, or the danger of overreaching themselves. The failure of Operation Citadel meant the Germans permanently lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front without any hope of regaining it, although Hitler refused to acknowledge it. The large manpower losses of the Wehrmacht in July and August 1943 severely restricted both Army Groups South and Center. Operations Polkovodets Rumyantsev, along with the concurrent Operation Kutuzov, marked the first time in the war that the Germans were not able to defeat a major Soviet offensive during the summer and regain their lost ground in the strategic initiative. Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev. Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev was a code name for the Belgorod-Khar'kov Offensive Operation conducted by the Red Army between the 3rd of August 1943 and the 23rd of August 1943 against the Wehrmacht's 4th Panzer Army and Army Group Kempf during World War II. The operation was named after the 18th-century Field Marshal Peter Rumyantsev and was conducted by the Voronezh and Steppe fronts in the Belgorod sector of the Kursk Bulge. The Germans refer to the battle as the Fourth Battle of Kharkov. The operation began in the early hours of 3 August 1943, with the objective of following up the successful Soviet defensive effort in the Battle for Kursk. The offensive was directed against the German Army Group South's northern flank. By August 23, 1943, the Soviet divisions of the Voronezh and Steppe fronts had successfully seized Kharkov from German forces. It was the last time that Kharkov changed hands during the Soviet-German War. The operation led to the retreat of the German forces in Ukraine behind the Dnepr River, and it set the stage for the Battle of Kiev in autumn 1943. Background: Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev had been planned by Styuka to be the major Soviet summer offensive in 1943. However, due to heavy losses sustained during the Battle of Kursk in July, time was needed for the Soviet formations to recover and regroup. Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev commenced on 3 August, with the aim of defeating the 4th Panzer Army, Army Group Kempf, and the southern wing of Army Group South. It was also hoped that the German 1st Panzer Army and the newly reformed 6th Army would be trapped by an advance of the Red Army forces to the Black Sea. The Soviet forces included the Voronezh Front and the Steppe Front, which deployed about 1,144,000 men with 2,418 tanks and 13,633 guns and rocket launchers for the attack. Against this, the German army could field 200,000 men and 237 tanks and assault guns. German Army Group South Commander General Erich von Manstein had anticipated that the Soviets would launch an attack across the Dnieper and Mias rivers in an attempt to reach the Black Sea, cutting off the German forces extended in the southern portion of Army Group South in a repeat of the Stalingrad disaster. When the Soviet Southern Front and the Southwestern Front launched just such an attack on 17 July, the Germans responded by moving the 2 SS Panzer Corps, 24th Corps and 48th Panzer Corps southward to blunt the Soviet offensive. In fact, these Soviet operations were intended to draw off German forces from the main thrust of the Soviet offensive, to dissipate the German reserve in anticipation for their main drive. The Soviet plan intended the 1st Tank Army and 5th Guards Army, supported by 2 additional mobile corps, to encircle Kharkov from the north and west. To the west, 4 separate tank corps would support. The 27th and 40th Armies would make supporting attacks as well. To the east and southeast, the 69th and 7th Guards Armies, followed by the 57th Army of the Southwestern Front, also supported the attack. The 6th Guards Army, which had been weakened after bearing the brunt of the German Kursk offensive, and the Soviet 53rd Army were also a part of the operation. The offensive was supported by a very heavy collection of artillery focused along the 30 km front. Launch of the offensive on 3 August. The offensive was begun with a heavy artillery barrage directed against the German defensive positions. Though the German defenders fought tenaciously, the 2 tank armies committed to the battle could not be held back. By 5 August, the Soviets had broken through the German defensive lines, moving into the rear areas and capturing Belgorod while advancing some 60 kilometers. Delivering powerful sledgehammer blows from the north and east, the attackers overwhelmed the German defenders. German reserves were shifted from the Ural sector and north from the Donbas regions in an attempt to stem the tide and slow down the Soviet attacks. Success was limited to the Grossdeutschland division, delaying the 40th Army by a day. 7 Panzer and motorized divisions making up the 3rd Panzer Corps, along with 4 infantry divisions, were assembled to counterattack into the flank of the advancing Soviet forces, but were checked. After 9 days, the 2nd SS Das Reich and 3rd SS Totenkopf divisions arrived and initiated a counterattack against the 2 Soviet armies near Belgorod-Khar'kov, 30 kilometers northwest of Kharkov. In the following armored battles of firepower and maneuver, the SS divisions destroyed a great many Soviet tanks. to assist the 6th Guards Army and the 1st Tank Army. The 5th Guards Tank Army joined the battles. All three Soviet armies suffered heavily, and the tank armies lost more than 800 of their initial 1,112 tanks. These Soviet reinforcements stopped the German counterattack, but their further offensive plans were blunted. With the Soviet advance around Belgorod-Khar'kov stopped, the Germans now began to attempt to close the gap between Attribution and Krasnokursk. The counterattack started on the 18th of August, and on the 20th of August, Totenkov and Grossdeutschland met behind the Soviet units. Parts of two Soviet armies and two tank corps were trapped, but the trapped units heavily outnumbered the German units. Many Soviet units were able to break out, while suffering heavy casualties. After this setback, the Soviet troops focused on Kharkov and captured it after heavy fighting on the 23rd of August. The battle is usually referred to as the Fourth Battle of Kharkov by the Germans and the Belgorod-Khar'kov Offensive Operation by the Soviets. The Soviet operations included several sub-phases. Belgorod-Khar'kov Offensive Operation, the 23rd of July 1943 to 14 August 1943. Belgorod-Khar'kov Offensive Operation, the 12th of August 1943 to 23 August 1943. Zamees Offensive Operation, the 12th of August 1943 to 23 August 1943. Aftermath. Losses for the operation are difficult to establish due to large numbers of transfers and missing in action. Soviet casualties in the Belgorod-Khar'kov sector during this operation are estimated to be 71,611 killed and 110,955 wounded, 1,864 tanks and 423 artillery guns were lost. German losses were at least 20,000 killed, 40,000 wounded, and 10,000 captured. German tank losses are estimated as several factors lower than Soviet tank losses.